Okay, well, I think those that have been joined us can join us later. They can catch the video later. Thanks everybody for joining. Of course, probably most of you know my name is Tim Killey, your president of the BC Trappers. Welcome to another webinar. Tonight we have presenters Kevin, board chair from the Forest Practices Board, and Doug and Tracy. So just do a couple. We'll kind of hold questions till the end. You can put your hand up and I can call upon you to ask your question. You can type your question in the chat, or you can type it in the question and answer box. Either of those, I'll monitor kind of all three spots for questions. And we'll get to the questions. We have left a bunch of time at the end for question and answer. So without much more, I'll pass it over to Kevin and let him do a little better introduction and turn it over to the presentation.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks to everybody for joining. Thanks, Tim, for inviting us. As Tim said, I'm the chair of the Forest Practices Board, and I'll be starting the presentation today, but I'll be sharing it with two of our senior investigators at the board, Doug Wall, who led the investigation into the Nasgo Fisher complaint, and Tracy Andrews, who led the Bobtail and Windy Mountain complaints. So I don't think I'm going to say too much more. We're going to cover a little bit about the board, but I just want to say we're trying to, by presenting three complaints, we'll give you a bit of a picture of what we've seen in terms of Fisher, the issues on the ground with respect to forestry, and some of the steps that we've recommended be taken to improve Fisher management. So with no further ado, Doug Wall's going to share his screen, and the three of us are basically going to alternate over about 45 minutes of slides. There should be plenty of time for question and answer at the end. So over to you, Doug.
Okay, Tim, can you give me privileges, please?
I think you should have it now, so try that.
No, I don't.
Okay. Yeah, it says your host, so now try, there you go. Yeah, okay.
There we go.
Okay, so maybe I'm going to lead the next couple slides. As I said, this is about our Fisher management and the board's experience. So next slide, Doug. We're going to cover the role of the board, just a quick primer so people understand what we do, talk about the three complaints, and then we're going to end up in a bit of a Q&A session at the back end. Next slide. So this is just a quick reminder for those of you who haven't heard of the Forest Practices Board. Our organization has a mandate established in legislation to be the independent watchdog for sound forest and range practices in BC. The board has just passed its 26th anniversary. It's been around since the mid-90s, and we're basically made up of 5 part-time appointed board members, 1 appointed full-time appointed chair, that's myself, and then 19 full-time staff. That's basically the professionals, foresters, biologists, an engineer, accountants, communication staff who actually do the frontline work and produce the material for the board to consider. So that's a little bit about who we are. Next slide. Just a reminder of some of the things we do. Our legal mandate covers a range of things. We're going to talk mostly about complaints, but one thing that we also do is we do audits of forest and range practices, and we look at all tenure holders, forest range, small ones, big ones, and we do about 10 to 12 audits in a year, look at plans and practices over a period of time, and this is basically where we tell whether licensees are actually complying with the legislation. And sometimes you'll see we put out press releases when the audits are underway, and when they're happening in your area, you might see something about that the board is coming to town. So that's a big chunk of what we do. Next slide. The other one that we're going to focus on here is that we have a mandate, essentially kind of like the ombudsperson for forestry matters. So if the public has a concern about compliance or about government enforcement, essentially they can come to us and lodge their complaint. And if it's about a forest and range practice, we have to investigate. Interestingly, the board's, over its 25-year history, has really adopted a process of trying to resolve complaints. We're not here to point blame, we're here to make things better. So a big focus of the investigators is to help get people talking, to try and find solutions and try and help avoid conflict in the future. Our powers in an investigation are essentially to make recommendations to the parties. We do not have the power to stop work or to levy fines, but I will say it's been a pleasant experience of mine. Licensees and parties involved really pay attention when the board makes recommendations, because the process works. You get people together, they listen, they understand their issues, and so the power of recommendations is actually quite powerful. Next slide. I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights of reports that we have also undertaken, not specifically around Fisher, that might be of interest. One we wanted to highlight, got a fair bit of press about 18 months ago, is a complaint around the management of biodiversity and old growth in the Prince George Natural Resource District, which is by a mile the biggest natural resource district and timber supply area in the province. And the concern that was launched by some local foresters was that following mountain pine beetle, there simply wasn't adequate management of old forests. What we found out is that the licensees are complying with a legal order, but that order essentially is out of date, was established in the early 2000s. It had some commitments to revisit the order periodically based on new science, and those had not been revisited. So we also found that based on that dated order, biodiversity values, similar to some of the things we're going to be talking about today around Fisher, are likely at high risk. So we recommended that the province first spatialize the old growth and high risk areas. And what that means is draw a line around it, make sure you know what you're protecting. Prince George is one of those unique areas where it had an aspatial order, or sort of a number at a large area, and you couldn't really tell the quality of the old forest. We also recommend that they revisit and update that legal order. And interestingly, the province has agreed to undertake both of those, and there's work underway to meet both of those recommendations. Next one. We also do special projects. You may have heard last week we released a special project on water resources, special report. And this is where we can essentially look at systemic errors or systemic performance issues across the province. When we look at a complaint or an audit, we're looking at a single licensee or a single activity in a specific area. What this allows us to do through special investigations or special reports is look at either the legislation as a whole or a practice province-wide and try and identify systemic changes across the province or somewhere else. So it lets us look at the big picture, essentially. So that's another piece of work that we have, a tool in our toolkit. And we're going to touch on one of these reports, tactical forest planning, and the link between that and forest, what they now call forest landscape planning. But we called for in 2019 the province to adopt essentially a better planning regime through a special report. And then the one I mentioned that was released last week, where we call for improvements to how water is managed under the Forest and Range Practices Act. So those essentially are the policy and legislative recommendations that operate province-wide. So that's another big chunk of what we do. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Doug and Tracy to talk about the 3 Fisher-related complaints that we have investigated in the past about 5 years. Doug.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name's Doug Wall. I'm a registered professional biologist, and I've been with the Forest Practices Board since 2008. Prior to that, a consultant to the forest and mining sectors. So I'm going to introduce the 3 complaint investigations that the board has undertaken in the last, since 2018. And as we go through the elements of each of the investigation, I'm going to talk to you about what was the complaint all about. All 3 complaints were made by trappers. What did the board find in its investigation, including the field work, and the recommendations made by the board. Now, in our presentation, when we get to the point about what recommendations were made to government or to licensees, which is one of the board's authority under FERPA, Kevin will speak to those recommendations. And the reason we're doing that is because along with the reports and the recommendations, they're owned by the board. So the board publishes the report and the board makes the recommendations. That's not made by staff, although we're certainly in an advisory role to the board for that function. Okay, so the 3 investigations we're talking about. I'm sure you're all familiar with the NASCO complaint in 2018. The bobtail complaint, that's the logging and fisher habitat near Prince George, call that the bobtail complaint in 2021. That investigation was led by Tracy. And the Windy Mountain complaint, also in late 2021, which is an investigation that I led, and I'll speak to that. So just to give you an overview where these complaint investigations took place, all in the central interior, all dealing with the Columbia population of fisher, which is red listed. One is the bobtail in the Prince George Natural Resource District, NASCO in Quesnel, and Windy Mountain in 100 Mile House. So first going to talk about the NASCO complaint. So what was this complaint all about? Well, it's similar to the others. Most of these have been about extensive salvage harvesting of mountain pine beetle stands, lack of coordination between multiple licensees operating on the same land base, and the impact that this harvesting is having on fisher and other wildlife habitat. So look on the ground. I think you can see vast open areas with little retention on the ground, really indicative of the entire NASCO area. Shows, you know, a lack of planning for fisher. Now, being mindful is that unless there's an objective, either a land use objective or a requirement in FERPA, there are no legal requirements to protect or manage for fisher habitat. And at the time of this investigation, there were no wildlife habitat areas, no wildlife habitat features, or nothing in the legislation that would legally prompt a licensee for managing for fisher. Stand level retention, you can see that although the intention was there in some cases to leave retention, well, it's required per cup block size in terms of the percent retention that's required on any cup block. Unfortunately, the bulk of that retention in this case is standing dead material and provides little opportunity for those key habitat elements for fisher, as you can see in the stand structure. Now, just to give you an overview, this is in this map, great map in the NASCO report, just to give you an idea of the extent of harvesting that's taken place over 15 years. On the left, in 2002, you can see quite a bit of dark green that is stands greater than 60 years old. That's going to spread obviously all over to older stands in the greater than 240 years. But on the right-hand side, you can see just the extent to which that mature and under mature stands have been harvested. So there's really, other than remnant patches, there's not much left on the landscape. And the challenge with fisher is, as we all know, and as of course trappers will know this better than just about anybody, is the extent of these patchwork of remnant patches, which does not provide the connectivity across the land base to provide for fisher habitat. So the board findings, go ahead, Kevin.
So based on what Doug reported, first thing Doug mentioned, sort of legal tools, you need to have an objective in order to compel licensees. And there are tools in FERPA that can be used to establish objectives for fisher, but they weren't being used. So we recommended that they use their tools. We also found that the sort of voluntary system in a timber supply area allowed licensees, relied on licensees to coordinate their planning. So one licensee could leave some habitat behind and assumed another one would, but in fact, we found that sometimes that didn't happen. There was little retention within cup blocks, as Doug said. The essentially just down to the minimums for wildlife tree patches and not sort of considering other habitat features. And then there was harvest guidance for retention planning following mountain pine beetle that was voluntary, established by the chief forester, and we found that was not being applied. Next slide.
By the way, sorry, Kevin, that was my first mistake of the evening. I should have spoken to that slide. You're on the recommendations here.
So this is where the board weighed in at the end of the process. We recommended two things. One is government undertake landscape level planning and ensure retention planning and harvesting is coordinated. Essentially look at the whole landscape and ensure licensees are operating under a common plan. And then the second one is use those legal tools that are available to protect the remaining fisher habitat in the NASCO area. So interesting, government agreed to number one. They recognized they had a coordination issue and they needed to do some planning at the landscape level. But for number two, government did not want to establish new land use requirements, but rather felt that it had existing legal objectives or existing measures in the Caribou-Chilcotin land use plan, along with voluntary measures by licensees. And just a little bit of backdrop on that, the Caribou-Chilcotin land use plan is one of those plans that does have a higher level plan order that has some kind of, I'd say, soft objectives or fuzzy objectives for habitat. So they felt the better approach was to use those and try and implement them. We'll come back to that later in the presentation, how that played out. So two kind of real kind of key themes for the board: use your tools, set some legal objectives, and coordinate licensee planning at the landscape level.
Okay, Bobtail, Tracy.
Hi, thanks, Doug. So yeah, the bobtail complaint came in 2019. We received this complaint from the holder of a trap line that was west of Prince George and north of Bobtail Mountain Park. That's a provincial park. Doug, maybe go to the next slide, please. So this area, this is looking towards the area that was logged, that's Bobtail Mountain Provincial Park in the background. The area of this complaint was right on the edge of the Bobtail fire, which my memory serves me correctly was 2014 or 2015. I'm sure some of you on the line remember that more clearly. So the blocks were in green timber just outside that fire perimeter, in between the fire area and Bobtail Mountain Provincial Park, so just west of the park. It's in the Prince George TSA, where multiple licensees are operating. This complaint was specific to some 3 blocks that Canfor was planning in green timber. The complainant was concerned that there had been no planning for wildlife habitat, while salvage harvesting had been going on in response to the mountain pine beetle and then the wildfire, and now spruce beetle was starting to show up in some of the green timber. Part of his complaint was that the overall trapping success had declined by 90% over the last 10 years, and he wanted Canfor to defer, to not log basically the 3 blocks they had planned, as he asserted they were in the last mature, suitable habitat for fisher within his trap line. So the board found, well, first of all, I guess there was 2 questions that we asked in this investigation. Number 1, did Canfor meet the legal requirements for the management of fisher habitat? Number 2, what did Canfor do to address the complainant's concerns? Well, as Doug established earlier, the same situation exists in the Prince George TSA. There are no legal requirements for the management of fisher habitat. So, we looked at whether the licensees met their stand level biodiversity requirements. So, they did leave wildlife tree retention areas, and they did leave riparian reserves. So those were the legal requirements that we found they did comply with. In fact, they went above the minimum requirements. They left more area than they were required to. They did provide some connection corridors along riparian areas, connecting mature timber to mature timber on the other side of the cut blocks. They did leave an enhanced network of wildlife tree reserves and retention within the 3 blocks. They left some debris piles, critter piles within the cut blocks. These were clear cut areas, but there was some of this stuff left inside the harvested area. So debris piles as habitat for fur bearers. And they did actually propose a landscape connectivity corridor between Doll Lake Park and Bobtail Mountain Park, and dropped 2 blocks from their group of blocks that had been shared at that point in time, basically deferring them until a later date. But we also found that they didn't use the tools that were available to them, namely the spatial fisher habitat tool. And they also didn't specifically hire a qualified professional to come and advise them on how to approach the harvesting in this area, even after fisher had been identified as a significant concern and value in this area. So this picture is the first block that they harvested of the 3. It was harvested right after the complaint was received. And you can see on this photo, they have left these windrows of slash, the connectivity corridors along the streams, and there's little patches of in-block retention. So next photo, Doug. This is the same cut block. This photo is taken from the ground. I think it's looking sort of southwest from the cut block, back into some of the area that might have been burned, perhaps. And you can see, you know, the quality of the in-block retention. There was some attempt to retain some deciduous stems inside the block. They're all quite small, but there was some attempt to leave some retention in the block. Next slide, please. This picture is of the 3rd block that was harvested. So this block was harvested a little while after we initiated the complaint investigation. In this block, they utilized a different harvest method. So they processed on the block, and it was like a forwarding system. So they were able to better protect some of the secondary stand structure within the block. They really worked to try to retain some of the understory trees, the smaller trees. They also were able to leave some larger pieces of coarse woody debris and slash in the block rather than piling it at roadside. Next slide, please, Doug. So here's a picture from the ground within that 3rd block, and you can see the better quality of the secondary structure. And there's some larger chunks of log that they were able to leave behind, and you know, hopefully this provided a little bit more habitat value in the end than maybe the first block that was harvested. Okay, next slide, and this one's over to Kevin for the recommendation summary.
Great. So essentially made recommendations first to government. And I want to say it was a really interesting debate or discussion. We tried to figure out who's ultimately accountable for doing better here. And we said that it really is a responsibility of government to set clear expectations of what is required in this landscape for fisher from the licensees. So we asked them to clarify those expectations as step 1. And then second, again, the theme you heard in NASCO is that we believe government needed to use the legal tools that are available to establish some goals for conserving fisher habitat throughout the whole Prince George Natural Resource District. The response is that government was initially, or was concerned that it should not be setting expectations around the content of forest stewardship plans. They're getting deep into kind of the policy element of FERPA. There is kind of a view amongst some that government can't set voluntary expectations, that it should only use legal tools. So they were concerned they should not force licensees to put certain things in their FSPs. But what government did do is that they are committed to using tools to establish new legal objectives for fisher throughout in the PG and our natural resource district. So that was pretty positive outcome from our perspective, is that they wanted to move ahead with the legal aspect side, but they were reluctant to set the voluntary expectations through an expectation letter. So that was part 1. Next slide. We also made a recommendation, though, to the licensee, as we said that once government clarifies its expectations, they should amend their FSP to reflect those expectations. So right now, Canfor's FSP would not have any legally enforceable objectives for fishers. So we said, government set expectations, and licensee Canfor, you should amend your FSP to include a specific commitment around managing fisher habitat. The response in this case, because government has declined to set voluntary expectations, licensee said it will respond once government set those expectations, likely now through a legal order. So that's where we landed. Over to Wendy, back to Tracy.
Doug. Thanks, Kevin. The Windy Mountain complaint is going to be quite different than the outcomes for the NASCO and the bobtail complaint investigations. And it really paints a picture about what can be achieved on the ground for fisher with strong direction and influence by government, with a licensee who's willing to do the right thing and listen and to the trapper and listen to the direction by government, and also a trapper that's heavily involved in ensuring that harvesting and road construction within his trapline area is done in a way that optimizes habitat management for fisher and other fur bearers. So the complaint, no different than the other two complaints, NASCO and bobtail, that harvesting, in this case by one licensee, which was BCTS, and the other cases in NASCO, if you remember, multiple licensees, and in bobtail, we focused on the Canfor because that's who the complaint was about. But again, that's another trapline area with multiple licensees working on the land base. And also in Windy is the trapper. There was a portion of the trapline area in the northeast section that had not been previously harvested. So we didn't want any more harvesting in the, not only that area, but actually in the trapline area altogether. And in particular in that northeast corner, really concerned about the fact that that was really, that untouched or unharvested stand is the last remaining intact fisher habitat. So what did we find? So first of all, BC Timber Sales, they met the requirements of the Forest Stewardship Plan. There was really good communication with the trapper. I will have to say in this case, and we saw in the NASCO and bobtail, there was always interest by the trappers to state their concerns to licensees and to government, which is really important. And we're going to talk about that as we wrap up this presentation. There were riparian reserves on streams. Now I'm talking about in FERPA, there's mandatory reserve widths adjacent to streams. I'm talking about reserve widths that are tenfold in width to what the legislation requires to really enhance the movement corridors along those riparian areas. There was a 600+ meter wide no harvest corridor through the entire trapline area that the trapper actually helped design. There was management around trap sites and bait stations, ended up being in the realm of a 100 to 250 meter buffer around trap sites and bait stations. And BCTS also used the fisher habitat tool. So the really important piece to this complaint investigation, certainly for me and I think for the board, is, well, what is going on here? Why are we seeing a departure from in the Windy complaint in terms of what is really achievable on the ground by, government, the licensees, and the trappers working together for a positive outcome for fisher? What's different? Well, that backstory is really important to explain to you. So In the, Kevin alluded to land use objectives in the Caribou-Chilcotin. And if you go to the website, Google Caribou-Chilcotin Land Use Plan, order the 90-day implementation plan. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of documents on the site. It's quite a challenge to wade through the different objectives and the revisions to those objectives, but I can say that there's a number of objectives for values like fur bears, and some of those objectives are pretty vague. Like an objective might be manage for fur bears. So what do you really do with that? What's a licensee supposed to do with that? And this is where the direction from government is so vital, because it needs to take that interpretation from those generic or those broad level objectives and help define what the expectation is for licensees to sort of implement that objective on the ground. And that's exactly what the 3 district managers that comprise the Caribou region did. So first, they started with expectations. So that's a letter of expectation that was sent out to licensees back in 2016. And it basically says, for a variety of values, from wildlife to biodiversity to fish habitat, this, given the Caribou-Chilcotin Land Use Plan order, this is what we expect licensees to achieve. That's at a voluntary level, right? It's a letter of expectation. It's not an order requiring them to achieve those objectives, but it's really to push them gently, persuade them into taking certain stewardship actions. So in the Caribou-Chilcotin, the district managers felt there wasn't a satisfactory response from that letter of expectation. And so their next step was to work quite hard to interpret what they felt were reasonable expectations for the protection of fisher habitat, fur bear habitat, and other values in the objectives in the Caribou-Chilcotin Land Use Plan. And they actually set out and made an order. So approved the next round of forest stewardship plans in the regions, subject to certain conditions. And those conditions were that all licensees would have to comply with a set of rules, basically, that they would have to follow. Specific to fur bears, those rules were they'd have to adopt the fisher habitat tool. They would have to ensure that they're communicating closely and considering feedback from trappers and other tenured holders. And in the case of fur bear habitat, much of what happened is really around the backcountry objective. So there's an objective in the Caribou-Chilcotin Land Use Order that said that consider input from backcountry users. Trappers are a subset of those backcountry users. So really what the district managers did is formalized what that means and made it conditional for the approval of the forest stewardship plans. So it really gave trappers a lot of strength to identify issues, and licensees had to consider what those concerns and comments were. And that probably is the biggest reason that we saw the number of unique strategies that were implemented in the Windy Mountain complaint. So really good work. The board was very pleased with the work that BCTS did. I might sort of add that the next round of forest stewardship plans, after the conditions were made, those conditions expired, and upon their new forest stewardship plan, BCTS adopted the same wording that was in their previous conditions, which I was really quite pleased about, and so was the board. So now you have a comprehensive set of requirements in a forest stewardship plan, which make it a legal requirement for BCTS to implement their forest stewardship plan, including a number of different strategies for the protection of fur bear habitat, specifically for fisher. So Kevin, I wanted, if you could take this slide here, just wrapping up, or we're going from, from these 3 complaint investigations, what they've resulted in really around building blocks for where we're at now, and then we'll go into forest landscape planning.
Yeah, so Doug summarized it really well. I mean, it's nice to have a good news story where we're seeing progress made. And I think I just want to also do a recognition to the complainants here, because the complainants brought issues to our attention. And I think our complaints and the results helped move along the management of Fisher by putting focus on it, identifying some opportunities, and helping spur some action. There's many people in the province and elsewhere who believed action was needed. And I think this really help complement those efforts. Most of you will have seen that the province has introduced a number of changes to the Forest and Range Practices Act, and has specifically said that it's bringing in a more active role for government to be the land manager and to set objectives through various mechanisms and tools. And that's something the board has called for almost a decade, where it's really essential that the government who represents the public interest be really clear what's wanted in terms of these competing values and competing land uses. So that's a change that signaled that's coming. Also just want to sort of signal that we've seen progress made in a number of elements around Fisher recovery, and specifically in the last 2 complaints more recently, the application of the habitat tool and various monitoring programs starting to apply. And then, as Doug mentioned, we want to sort of shine a light on the new opportunity looking forward for better managing a number of values through forest landscape planning, basically enabled through the changes to the Forest and Range Practices Act passed in December of 2021 in what's called Bill 23. So this picture that Doug found, which I think is really groovy, we've talked a little bit about the level of planning on the left that many of you are familiar with, strategic land use planning. That's the Caribou-Chilcotin land use plan in 2 of the complaints, and the Prince George Land and Resource Management Plan. And that's the big picture. And as we saw, sometimes it has stuff and sometimes it's a bit fuzzy. And over on the very right-hand side is what you're familiar with operational planning, basically a forest stewardship plan or a site level plan at a cut block level. And essentially, they've introduced a new planning level in the middle called forest landscape planning, which will basically provide an interpretation between that strategic scale and will direct the operational scale currently undertaken exclusively by licensees. So this is an opportunity for government to set much more clear direction for a range of values at the landscape level. There's some characteristics of it that are still being worked out, but it is designed to have partnership with Indigenous people, and really importantly, also to have deeper engagement and involvement by stakeholders and local governments. So it is coming. There's still a lot of work to do to make forest landscape plans real, but I think of interest, there are 2 pilots in this general region. One in the Quesnel area is one of 4 province-wide pilots. And there's also one in the Lakes timber supply area. So those will be sort of trying to figure out what this new forest landscape planning process will look like. And eventually this will roll across the province. They expect it'll take about 8 to 10 years to complete planning for the whole province, and then a plan will be in force for about 10 years. So pay attention, because this is going to essentially supersede the forest stewardship plan process. Over time, that will be displaced and replaced with this new forest landscape planning process. I don't think, is this my slide, Doug? I think so.
Sure.
You go first.
Okay. So I've learned, certainly quite a bit from how effective trappers are in terms of voicing their concerns about habitat management. And it's not just the interests of certainly in terms of returns. It's a really conscientious, conservation-minded concern about fur bearers and other wildlife on the land base. And really quite impressed with the level of knowledge. There's no doubt in my mind when I'm out in the bush with trappers that they're the lead in terms of knowledge of fur bearer habitat within their trapline areas. So trappers have a voice, and it's an effective voice. And certainly I would promote using it as often as possible. Certainly from the Windy experience, and there's no doubt that this is a demand on your time, but the result was quite impressive, certainly in Windy, in terms of what that, sticking on point with the concerns that the trapper had over multiple years really yielded quite good results in terms of the stewardship actions. So I encourage you to keep talking to licensees, talking to government, expressing your views, and responding to referrals. I know some of you probably have stacks of manila envelopes on your kitchen tables. Really important to get through those, because if you don't respond to the referral, the licensee doesn't necessarily take action. So you have to put it on paper, preferably in writing, about what your concerns are. Make yourself heard. Asset licensees, again, in writing that they're managing fur bearer habitat. And this next one might go against your, your concerns about releasing information about trap sites and bait stations and other key habitat elements. But think about this way: if the licensees don't know about it, if government don't know about it, then it's subject to be harvested. So you have to get that information to them if you want these areas managed. Attend field reviews. Really, that's where the rubber hits the road, is getting out on the ground with licensees to talk about what can be done to manage for fur bearer habitat. And really, as Kevin talked about, the forest landscape planning, the pilot projects, absolutely critical to stay in the loop about what's going on in terms of these broader initiatives. Also, the fishery recovery team. I know, Scott, you're on the line. Sorry if I got the name wrong, but quite impressive set of tools, and that I only hope that will get refined and improved over time around the spatial fisher habitat tool. Have a look at that. Just Google spatial fisher habitat tool. You'll find all the information. There's a website dedicated to the tools. And I know that government has a strong interest in improving those tools over time. They're engaging with professionals through a series of webinars that I'm sure you've had access to, which are all hold a lot of promise in terms of a change in direction, a new direction, really focusing on fur bearer habitat management, probably as an indicator of the health of the ecosystem, or one of the indicators that we can use as an indicator, or sorry, of for the health of the ecosystem. So keep your eyes and ears open and stay engaged.
So Tim, I think we're at questions.
Okay, the first one that I saw come in was, could you please reiterate or clarify the fisher habitat tools that are in FERPA?
Maybe we'll let Tracy take that one, because she spent a lot of time figuring out the fisher habitat tool.
Sure. So the fisher habitat tool that Doug's referring to is a tool that's been developed to help foresters, land managers understand what the stand. It's a stand level tool. So at that sort of cut block level, when they're planning cut blocks, they can use the tool to understand, based on the vegetation resource inventory data for the area, which is a pretty general forest cover inventory. And it's also based upon data of which types of stands fishers like to use for the different habitat needs. So when they're planning to log a cut block, they can use this tool to say spatially, where in this area is the highest value habitat that I should be doing some field level investigation of to see if it's actually there, if it's valuable, and maybe prioritizing that area for retention when the stand gets logged, and if the stand gets logged. As far as a linkage to FERPA, I can't say that there is a direct linkage to an actual legal requirement, especially where there's no legal requirements to manage for Fisher. But I can tell you that the province is actively using that tool and actually developing a new analysis for it that looks at habitat at more of a territory level or a home range level for Fisher that will enable them to identify what habitat elements should be incorporated into some of these new legal orders, right? So it's a tool to help make some decisions. It's not necessarily, I doubt that it would be just a straight up legal requirement to like use this tool in FERPA, but it's helping to make some decisions. And did Scott just? Oh, yeah.
Tracy, you're doing a great job, though.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, you're describing it fantastic. I could go into minor details, but you covered the high levels of it quite well. Okay,
well, that's great. I'm glad that we had a chance to connect over the last couple of days, and you can update me on what you guys are working on. So Scott was telling me that the work that they're doing on the tool to develop this more territory level analysis is going to be very helpful for in the Omineeka, where they are working on sort of the legal requirements based on the board's bobtail investigation, but also helping to satisfy some of the data needs that the forest landscape planning tables are asking for or looking for. So it's a really valuable tool to have, and we're happy to hear that it's continuing to be invested in and improved upon.
So, I mean, I guess a little bit further too for Scott. I mean, the Fisher team has invited trappers to contact them through me if need be. If you do have a area that you believe has got good Fisher habitat and maybe the licensee hasn't dealt with that, then we can connect them with Scott to get those tools and get those overlays and take a look at that sort of stuff too. So you can definitely reach out through me, and Scott and his team have volunteered to help work with a few trappers to try to push the industry a little bit to get those tools to us, or those overlays to see that information.
And just further to that, Tim, and sorry, Kevin, Doug said a moment ago, of all those manila envelopes on your kitchen tables and the referral requests, that we haven't developed that easy tool for you all to use to run those. But we certainly have recognized that that's probably an important and valuable tool for you and for me, who's one trying to improve stewardship for the species in the province, to have that linkage to the tools, and so to ask of licensees to please run their cut blocks and evaluate the tools, and to give you all the trappers in your referral response some language and some response of how to communicate with the licensees on that is something desired and that we need to work on over time here. It's not available currently, but you know what? Nothing happens like a request to get stuff done. Might not happen fast, but we are here to help.
I'll just add a bit of color too, just to back to the question about how this links to FERPA. I think FERPA has really two paths where practices can get invoked. One is licensees can voluntarily do things. So that's what Doug is indicating. If trappers ask, they have at least a duty to respond. And even though there may not be a legal objective, if they respond, generally, licensees look to best practices. And in this case, the Fisher Habitat tool starts to help you identify what those best practices are. So it's useful in that voluntary realm. But secondly, FERPA being a results-based system, even when there is a legal requirement, it doesn't give very prescriptive how to in this kind of situation. Again, that's left to professional alliance using a combination of biologists and foresters trying to figure out what the best prescription is in that site. And that's where even in a legal realm, the habitat tool, the Fisher tool helps figure that out. So what you need is either a legal tool that says do something about Fisher, and then the habitat tool helps figure out what that is on a site-specific basis, or even in the voluntary world, it can help licensees navigate their way through what are the kind of appropriate solutions to help manage Fisher in this landscape.
And that was the important work really of the 3 district managers in the Cariboo region to take that broad objective again for fur bears, manage fur bear habitat. And one of the ways they decided that that was going to happen would be that you would be required to use the Fisher habitat tool. And where it identified a certain type 1 or type 2 habitat, it gave instruction that you would have to hire a professional to prepare a management plan. It didn't prescribe exactly what would happen, but it was really raises a red flag that you're in an area of that's identified potentially as important habitat, and you have to hire a professional to sort of develop the right prescription on the ground. And we know that this isn't a perfect tool. You know, trappers out there that, first of all, I would highly recommend that you would, if you're in an area that licensees are not applying this tool, let them know about it. When it's understand and find out when the next forest stewardship plan is up for renewal, because that's another opportunity where you have to comment on what you would like to see added to that forest stewardship plan. And that's the only way that progress can be made, is that you have a voice to let licensees know and government know that your interests are being managed.
Oh, you didn't get that question, did you? I was muted. Technical difficulties. Next question was from a trapper. I was on the trap line today. They're cutting down 300 loads of green trees in the middle of a 20,000 hectare forest fire. Why aren't they salvaging the burned trees?
Boy. I'll take that one. I will say we haven't done a lot of work on fire salvage recently, but in the past the board has weighed in a little bit on this. There are some guidelines from the chief forester that were put out after the 2017 fire, putting out some recommendations for how to approach post-wildfire salvage, including some of the considerations for how much retention, particularly as the larger fires, guidance around enhanced retention. And there's a general guideline, I don't know if it's, I think it's in that package, that green should be left where feasible. So I'll just say the place to take a look would be to find those chief foresters guidelines, and I can find a link, Tim, and circulate it afterwards around retention and take a look at those. What they actually can harvest is a very complicated mix of economics and fire damage and distance. And generally, if the bowl is actually blackened, it's really hard to salvage because the chip can't be taken to a pulp mill. So the way BC's forest sector is structured, they generally take burnt wood if it's just burnt through to the bark, but not if it actually blackens the bowl. So often you'll see in fires today, retention, the actual amount harvested of fire damage is relatively small. Sometimes 10, 20, 30%. And a lot of it, if it's got more significant damage, is left standing. But then again, that comes back to, in those places, there is an emphasis in the retention planning if there are green skips to try and leave the green skips behind. So that's about as much as I can say on that. It's a kind of complicated topic, and Tim, I'll see if I can find that reference and circulate it afterward.
Good, thank you. What I'll try to do too, for those that maybe can't see or didn't look at the chat box, but the previous reports are all available on the Forest Practices website, and they posted the link in the chat box for us, but I can try to circulate this to people later too as well. So any other previous reports they've talked about, or if you're curious to look up other reports like the bridge, road work, all that sort of stuff, all those reports are public on their website to look at. Next question, why only apply this to a cut block? A fisher's home range is much larger than a cut block, and fishers require all necessary features in their home range, plus enough undistributed area to rear their young and retain healthy populations.
I guess I'll start on that one. I mean, I think that's exactly why in the bobtail investigation, the board felt very strongly about commenting on the bigger picture. Like, our investigation did focus on the 3 cut blocks and the legal requirements at the stand level, but acknowledged that as was done in NASCO, that this is a species with habitat needs that does need to be managed at a landscape level, and really one of the best ways of doing that is for someone to take a leadership role and plan for it at that more landscape level. And that's where the board called on government to take that role on in the bobtail and in the NASCO, and here we are. So.
Okay, next question. Kevin stated that it was 8 to 10 years for all of this to get in place for fishers. Fishers will not last this long at a current rate of cutting. I mean, you did talk about some of the changes that happen intermediately, I guess, within Caribou and the Prince George District. So I guess some of us are concerned to say, well, we might have another 1 to 5 years until new FERPA comes into place, and then how many more years until the landscape plans are developed, and do they have to update their forward stewardship plans to adopt to that sooner than later? So, most of our members are going to say we don't have that kind of time for bear population in this province. So how can we push that system so we don't have those kinds of time to comply?
I'll take a stab first. I think the timeline is a concern. Forest landscape planning could be a really big benefit, and it'll come to some places sooner. So if it comes, get involved. I think it's going to be a huge opportunity. But I think the point, Tim, is don't just wait for that. There are opportunities to have influence under the current system. And so, pursue both tracks, I think, is the simplest answer.
And the way to pursue it under the current system is all those ways Doug listed on that last slide, right? Like, really be involved, put your concerns in writing, be as active as you can, and vocal.
Okay, I'm not seeing a lot more questions come in, so we'll give it a minute or two. I mean, these fine people volunteered their evening and gave us more time for question and answer. So if you got some other questions, or we can maybe go outside of these topics a little bit if it's forestry related, or something that you've read on past. We'll maybe give it a couple more minutes for anybody to type in some questions or raise their hand.
Tim, I'm interested in hearing from any members who have had some positive examples from working with licensees on managing fur bearer habitat.
Scott raised his hand. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I was not going to address Doug's question, but well, folks are maybe thinking of a good experience there. Just wanted to weigh in on some comments a moment ago. I actually was speaking and I did the typical. I started chatting, but was on mute. So Tracy was talking about, or the question was, why at the stand scale, not larger? And Tracy responded appropriately, and Kevin as well, that it is all about planning. And the program that I'm leading right now, we are trying to take those things into consideration. We're certainly recognizing that fishers need habitat on multiple scales, and the land managers need decision support. They need information at multiple scales as well. So, we're taking the fishery ecology at the smallest scale, what we know, and they absolutely have to think about the species in the large scales, as the question and trappers know. A female has a 30 square kilometer home range, and you need multiple animals next to each other to be interacting, to have babies. And so these are really large areas that need to be thoughtfully considered. And so we are in a process of trying to develop that guidance, to promote it and to deliver it to the forest landscape plans as they get developed. We are at the tables talking to them. They've requested that, fisher at both the Lakes and Quesnel FLP tables. They want to know more about them. They are interested in the species. And from my perspective, I'm really happy to be talking with them, because we need to design guidance for them that will be appropriate for them and others working at that scale in the future FLPs to hopefully quickly integrate and get the action happening, as soon as it can. The 10-year time frame, it is concerning. It's concerning for this species over large areas of the central interior. There are pockets where there is good remaining habitat, and hopefully those are the areas that we'll be able to focus and concentrate on, and grow the fisher population back from that. Ideally, if we can get into the hands of the land managers good guidance of how to do this on a large scale, and if they accept it, and hopefully we'll be working on getting those legal tools in place that Kevin and Doug and Tracy have been talking about. It's moving in the right direction, but it is going slowly, unfortunately.
So we did have one trapper said he's met in person with our current district manager and wrote tons of letters to forestry and the companies with zero results, not even a response in most cases. I don't see too many people that generally get positive feedback, but I guess we'll have to keep pushing for the change. Another one, not many positive examples. The responses from licensees is that they are following the current practices and that the timber that is left behind enough for fur bearer management. But my trap line is on the coast and it does not have red listed species that he's aware of. One question that come to mind for me, maybe for you, Doug, as a biologist, when you said coordination planning, what kinds of points should we be seeing or asking for in a referral? And or especially when you say, don't use a professional biologist to review, say, wildlife habitat type of issues, what kind of things should we be looking or asking for that would be kind of required in?
Yeah. Okay. So in the Caribou region, where by extension of the conditions of approval for the forest stewardship plans and the subsequent newly approved forest stewardship plans, as I said, there is a requirement to utilize the fisher habitat tool and to hire a professional. So, I doubt, if I were a consultant, I probably wouldn't regard myself as a fisher specialist. So what you want to do is make sure that you're aware of who the professional is that the licensee is using, to make sure they have a well-rounded background in fishery ecology and management. And not only that, I think it's important that there's an avenue that, in the way I regard it, for the knowledge that trappers have in fur bearer, although they're not sort of recognized in the FERCA realm as professionals, because they're not sort of a member of a professional association, but in terms of the knowledge base, there's certainly superior level of knowledge in fur bearer habitat requirements and stewardship and sort of management of the forest to optimize habitat conditions. But I'm not sure if I really nailed the question that the member had about that, or that you do, Tim, about that. What I can say, it concerned me about the previous trapper who said that they've worked with licensees or communicated the information to licensees on numerous occasions, hadn't had a word back yet. That trapper and all trappers are, if you have a concern, contact the Forest Practices Board. And what we would want to do is ensure that you've made those efforts to communicate with licensees and government. But if you're having struggles, give us a call and maybe we can give you a hand to point you in the right direction, or to at least set up that communication between the licensees and yourselves, because that's a concern. If you're communicating your concerns repeatedly to licensees and not getting a response, that's an issue.
Another question here: when agreements were made with Canfor about where to leave debris windrows for small mammals and it didn't happen, the main excuse is there wasn't much debris and it's very costly to create the plows and windrows.
Hard to comment on a specific situation, but I certainly think you're seeing, we've seen it, or I've seen it in a number of places, increasing recognition that these windrows or wildlife piles left behind can be designated, and you're starting to see that more commonly. It is a cost factor, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. So I think just keep pushing for it. And you're seeing, I think, an increasing recognition by some foresters that that's a good practice to include. And it is being done more often than you would have seen 3, 4, 5 years ago. So I'd say just keep pushing.
Kevin Scott here. Can I add to that question? In that I've heard from a number of licensees concerns that the wastage rules are penalizing them. So they are concerned about leaving, getting dinged for that. And there is a clause, I believe, and I apologize, I don't recall the name of the wastage manual, but I recall seeing a clause in there to the effect of, that it can't be found to be exempt, even for conservation actions. Do any of you know much about that?
Yeah, I'll just say, Scott, it's absolutely, first they should generally be buying up the stuff that would otherwise get burned, but if they have a specific ecological objective built into their prescription, then it can be exempted from waste. There's a bit of a debate about how much and so on, but that problem can be solved for coarse woody debris and so on. But in a lot of these sites, there's plenty of coarse woody debris. It just usually goes up in smoke. Yeah. And the secret is to leave it in a designated pile, and it's really about getting exemption from the burning requirements. But again, a forester can do that if it's explicitly planned for a wildlife objective as part of their site plan. They can get exempt from the hazard abatement requirements. So, and that's becoming more commonly done. They're learning how to do it.
Great, thank you.
Kind of further to that, is it waste if they cut it down and it goes to the ground versus leaving a dead standing tree or leaving smaller stuff behind? I think there's studies from UNBC that are showing that our means of clear cutting and not allowing a variety of trees in the forest and going to a pine monoculture, we're losing that coarse woody debris over time, and the structure that should be on the landscape to what it is. So if they leave it a dead standing tree still out there, or leave it small, is that considered wastage when they're assessing waste, or is that if it's still standing, is that not considered waste?
Again, Tim, I think you're hitting, as long as they design it for an ecological purpose, they can leave green trees standing legacies, and they're not billed for that. So that's exempt from their stumpage payments and all that stuff. They just have to have a purpose for doing it. And I think part of what you're getting at, though, is just hasn't been done. Largely, and I'm going to come back to Tracy's presentation, sort of the harvest methods used in the interior were pretty simple and pretty crude. Big feller bunchers and really big skidders. And it's actually really hard to leave much standing, and the system just forgot how. So when we go to bobtail, although it wasn't any, you know, it was not any magic bullet, the fact that Canfor started using an alternate harvest system with a forwarder that lets you actually leave more structure behind, that's where the future lies in terms of designing more post-harvest legacies. And there's plenty of tools to deal with the concerns around waste and residue. It's just, it has to be an ecological objective. But the bigger barrier is the harvest systems used predominantly in interior just don't make that feasible, and they've got to move the type of equipment.
Okay. Brian Monroe put his hand up. You should be able to unmute yourself and go ahead, Brian. Still muted, Brian. You should know how to do it by now. There aren't enough Zoom calls with us. He's feverishly looking for the button, I'm sure. Oh, you had it. There you go, Brian. Now you look good. But we don't hear you, Brian. You're unmuted, but we're not making you, or not getting any voice from you.
Is that working?
There we go. Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to try this. I actually backed out of the question, but I'm going to try it anyway. I'm wondering why the Forest Practices Board hasn't lobbied government to actually give them some clout. When you go back over, and I do have a little bit of background with the Forest Practices Board. When you go back over all the things that you've accomplished or worked on over the last number of years, one of the things that consistently comes up is government's not, or companies are not following the government rules. And so you publish it and 3 people read it and nothing happens. And the next year you publish a very similar thing and the same thing happens again and again and again. So I'm wondering, why haven't you, on your own behalf, made yourself much more powerful?
I'll just take that one. It's a complicated answer, but we're a creature of statute. We get our directions from the legislature. I think really it's up to people like you to lobby the politicians, and they can change our mandate. There have been conversations about extending the mandate of the board out to a natural resources focus and so on, but that hasn't happened. So really, the question really is directed at the politicians who give us our instructions. What I'll say is that in terms of the substance of your question, we actually find that pretty good compliance with the rules. That's generally not a problem. And mostly when licensees get found of not obeying the rules, we see fairly quick efforts to comply. The larger issue that we're witnessing here is there aren't clear rules for the values that are of interest. Either there has never been an objective set for some of these habitat values, or the objectives are kind of fuzzy and left to, I'll call it too much sort of licensee discretion, and government needs to sort of step in and set more clear objectives. So the board has been involved in trying to get that message across for about a decade. And what now, some of the changes that are coming about, they're coming about slowly, but the changes in FERPA are a step in the right direction of putting more emphasis back on government as decision makers and government setting the objectives that we need. But I think the challenge is it's just taken a long time. So, but I'd say the larger issue isn't licensee compliance. The larger issue is we need more clear direction on how to conserve some of these habitats for multiple values.
Okay, thank you. We got another, mostly just a comment. I think the trouble now is that there is going to be no diverse old growth stands left shortly. Many problems, monoforest planted, and still the use of herbicides right now in the Prince George district is what his intention was there.
Yeah, not much to add on that.
And I think that's the last question I can see. Make a quick last call if anybody. Well, we got one other comment here. Scott just posted for us. He said there was a new video just posted to YouTube about
Just the
building
chat about
trails.
building. Yeah, the chat about leaving Course Wood just reminded me that just today we posted a new video, and it's 9.5 minutes long, but well, we're as a team we're proud of it, so sharing it, and in essence it's one of our approaches of how we're trying to communicate the licensees or anybody who's out there managing. So if y'all are interested and or you could perhaps even use that as response and a referral to say, have you considered this in your actions? I suppose it could function as that a little bit. So anyhow, hopefully it's 9.5 minutes for you. Shameless plug for our team there. Sorry.
You do what you
Well,
gotta
I mean, I think it helps. We need all the tools we can. I think when we're dealing with individual licensees, sometimes they balk and argue with us and say they can't do this, they can't do that, and you know, if we can guide them to things like a video like that shows them what they should be doing, it carries a little bit of weight. So, you know, I don't think it's necessarily a shameless plug. We're looking for that advice, so to speak. So
Thank you, Tim.
Maybe I'll just add to that theme. I've heard a few people saying, you know, things aren't being done and so on. We know they can be. Like there are some issues raised around stumpage. Well, that can be solved, and waste, and that can be solved. And the example from Scott about how to design piles and do it properly so they're effective as habitat, well, that can be solved. So slowly, I think we're starting to see some of these solutions that somebody adopted somewhere, and maybe others weren't as creative or interested. And I think you're starting to see them become more common. And so sharing those examples of how it can be successful, it's often one of the greatest ways of incenting a licensee and say, look, your neighbor did it. You know, this can work. These are not impossible solutions. So I really like that kind of positive, constructive approach. And I think you're starting to see a bit of, I certainly know the forest industry today has a much higher awareness that they've got a problem they wouldn't have been aware of or were in denial around 3, 4, 5 years ago. So keep pushing.
okay, well, I think I'm going to call it a wrap for this evening. We thank Kevin, Doug, and Tracy for your time this evening. We do appreciate it, and I think lots of members do appreciate that time and the information they gain from these. And I'm sure we'll probably be back here doing something else of the nature in the near future. So thank you for your time. I thank the trappers for your time to come and listen tonight. We you know, try to get the webinars out here and give us at least some sort of information in these ugly COVID times, and we can't meet face to face like we really like to. So thank you for all your time, and any last comments from Kevin or anybody on the team there?
No. Thanks for your time, folks. We appreciate it.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.